The Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences looked exactly like what happens when you give pretentious academics unlimited funding and zero adult supervision. Towering spires of crystalline mathematics stretched toward artificial suns, while holographic equations drifted through the air like particularly nerdy snow. And at the center of it all sat the crown jewel of cosmic confusion, the Vorthak Paradox. For 347 years, this mathematical impossibility had been the galaxy's most prestigious unsolvable problem. Think of it as the ultimate academic participation trophy, except instead of getting a ribbon, you got tenure and speaking engagements across 17 star systems. Professor Glimmerfin, a fish-like creature whose gills fluttered with self-importance, presided over the daily ritual of intelligent failure. His scales shimmered with academic authority as he addressed his elite team of scholars. "Colleagues," Glimmerfin announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of expensive education, "today marks another glorious day in our noble pursuit of the impossible. Let us once again attempt to unravel the mysteries of the Vorthak Paradox." Around the massive holographic display, three of the galaxy's most celebrated minds nodded with practiced solemnity. Zephyr, a crystalline being whose geometric perfection made Swiss watches look sloppy, adjusted her angular form with mechanical precision. "Professor, I have recalibrated my quantum matrices to the 14,000th decimal place. Surely today we shall achieve breakthrough." Krogmar, whose species had evolved from predatory warriors into predatory academics, flexed his forearms menacingly. "The paradox must be conquered through tactical superiority. I have developed 17 new strategic approaches to mathematical domination." Pip, an insectoid whose compound eyes reflected anxiety from every possible angle, chittered nervously. "But what if we are not worthy of solving it? What if our minds are too small? What if we have been approaching this all wrong for 3.5 centuries? "Nonsense," Glimmerfin declared, his fins practically vibrating with pompous authority. "We are the finest minds in the galaxy. If the Vorthak Paradox cannot be solved by us, then clearly it is meant to remain unsolved. We are not failing, we are preserving the cosmic order." The Vorthak Paradox itself floated before them in all its incomprehensible glory. Numbers and symbols danced in impossible formations, defying logic, reason, and several fundamental laws of mathematics. It was beautiful in the way that only truly expensive mistakes can be beautiful. Each day they would gather around it, stroke their various appendages thoughtfully, make profound observations about the nature of impossibility, and then adjourn for lunch at the Institute's 5-star cafeteria. It was a perfect system, really. The paradox remained unsolved, the scholars remained employed, and the galaxy remained impressed by their noble failure. Today, Zephyr announced with crystalline certainty, "I shall attempt the Heisenberg-Fibonacci approximation method." While I, Krogmar declared, "shall wage computational warfare using the Blitzkrieg integration technique." Pip just whimpered softly. "What if we accidentally solve it and then have nothing left to do?" They set to work with the practiced efficiency of professional procrastinators, their brilliant minds generating spectacular displays of mathematical pyrotechnics that accomplished absolutely nothing. Equations bloomed and wilted like exotic flowers, theories rose and fell like empires, and the Vorthak Paradox remained exactly as incomprehensible as it had been that morning. By noon they had successfully failed in 17 different ways, each more elegant than the last. It was, by all accounts, another productive day at the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences. The coffee machine was broken again, in a facility that could bend space-time for convenience and had solved the unified theory of everything except the Vorthak Paradox. The Earth-manufactured coffee machine was the only piece of technology that worked reliably, which naturally meant it was also the only thing that broke down regularly. Jake Murphy arrived at precisely the wrong moment, carrying a toolbox that looked like it had survived several wars and at least one apocalypse. He was human, which in galactic terms meant he was considered roughly equivalent to a particularly clever houseplant. "Someone call for maintenance?" Jake asked, wiping his hands on coveralls that had seen better decades. The scholarly discussion came to an abrupt halt. 4 pairs of alien eyes, plus Pip's several dozen compound lenses, focused on this unexpected interruption to their daily routine of prestigious failure. "Ah," Professor Glimmerfin said, his gills closing with barely concealed disdain. "The primitive arrives. Yes, the caffeine dispenser requires your crude mechanical intervention. Please be quick about it. We are in the middle of profound contemplation. Jake shrugged and headed toward the coffee machine, which was making sounds like a dying whale with mechanical problems. Sure thing, Doc. Just give me a minute to see what's wrong with old reliable here. Zephyr's crystalline form practically vibrated with offense. Old reliable? This is a precision instrument crafted by your species' finest engineers. Yeah, that's why it breaks down every 3 weeks, Jake replied, popping open the machine's access panel. Earth tech. Built to last exactly as long as the warranty, then fall apart spectacularly. As Jake worked, the scholars found themselves unwillingly fascinated by this primitive creature's casual competence. He didn't measure twice and cut once, he just sort of knew where the problem was and fixed it. So what's that thing? Jake asked, nodding toward the holographic display while his hands remained busy with the coffee machine's innards. That, Glimmerfin said with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, is the Vorthak Paradox. The greatest unsolved mystery in galactic history. For 347 years, the finest minds in the universe have attempted to unravel its secrets. Jake glanced at the floating mathematical impossibility while replacing a worn gasket. Huh, looks complicated. Complicated? Krogmar's warrior instincts flared. It is the ultimate challenge. An unconquerable fortress of pure mathematics. We have dedicated our entire careers to this noble pursuit, Zephyr added, her geometric perfection somehow managing to convey smugness. Yeah? Jake closed the access panel and hit the machine's power button. It hummed to life with the satisfied sound of properly functioning mediocrity. What's it supposed to do? The question hung in the air like a bad smell. The scholars exchanged glances that somehow managed to be both superior and uncertain. Do. Pip chittered nervously. It does not do anything. It simply is. It represents the fundamental limits of knowledge itself, Glimmerfin explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly slow child. Some things are not meant to be understood, only contemplated. Jake scratched his head, leaving a small smudge of coffee machine grease in his hair. So you've been staring at a math problem for 300 years, and nobody's asked what it's actually supposed to solve? The pursuit of knowledge requires no practical application, Zephyr declared. Pure mathematics is its own reward. Right, Jake said, clearly not convinced. Well, coffee's working again. Same time next month? But as he packed up his tools, Jake kept glancing at the paradox. There was something about it that looked familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a crossword puzzle clue that was right on the tip of his tongue. You know, he said slowly, that thing kind of reminds me of something. The scholar's attention sharpened with the intensity of predators spotting wounded prey. Oh? Glimmerfin's gills fluttered with barely contained condescension. And what might that be? Jake shouldered his toolbox and headed for the door. Give me a minute to think about it. Jake came back the next day, ostensibly to check on the coffee machine, but really because the paradox had been bothering him like a song stuck in his head. The scholars were in their usual positions around the holographic display, contemplating the incomprehensible with the dedication of monks contemplating their navels. Still working on that math thing? Jake asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of disappointment. We prefer the term advancing the boundaries of theoretical knowledge, Glimmerfin corrected with fish-like superiority. Sure. Jake studied the floating equations while sipping his coffee. So, who built this thing originally? Another one of those awkward silences fell over the room. You could practically hear the scholars' brains trying to process this shockingly simple question. Built? Zephyr's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly. The Vorthak Paradox was discovered, not built. It is a natural phenomenon. Discovered where? In the mathematical realm, obviously, Krogmar declared, though his usual warrior confidence seemed somewhat diminished. It exists in the space between numbers. Jake nodded slowly, the way mechanics do when customers explain that their car is making a whirring, clicking boom sound. Right. And you found it how exactly? The ancient Vorthak civilization first documented its existence, Pip chittered rapidly. They spent their entire cultural period attempting to solve it before their civilization collapsed under the weight of its impossibility. Okay, so the Vorthaks found this thing. Where? Manmire. In their mathematical archives, naturally. Their archives of what? Mathematical theorems, computational frameworks, advanced algorithmic structures. Glimmerfin's voice trailed off as he realized where this was going. So they were trying to solve something, Jake pressed. What were they trying to solve? The silence stretched like taffy. Finally, Pip whispered, "We do not know." The original context was lost when their civilization fell. Jake set down his coffee cup with the deliberate care of someone who had just realized he was surrounded by highly educated idiots. Let me get this straight. You've been trying to solve a math problem for 300 years and you don't know what the problem is supposed to be about? The specific application is irrelevant, Zephyr protested, her geometric perfection developing what could only be described as angles of annoyance. Pure mathematics transcends mundane concerns. Does it, though? Jake walked around the holographic display, studying it from different angles. Because this thing right here, this part that's been giving you trouble, he pointed at a section of the paradox that seemed to twist back on itself. That looks like a feedback loop. A what? Krogmar demanded. A feedback loop. You know, like when your audio system starts screeching because the microphone is too close to the speakers. Jake traced the mathematical structures with his finger. See how this equation feeds back into itself? That's not a paradox, that's just bad system design. The scholars stared at him with the expression of people who had just been told that their life's work was essentially cosmic microphone feedback. Furthermore, Jake continued, warming to his theme, this section over here looks like it's trying to divide by 0, which is like trying to measure how much nothing weighs. And this bit, he pointed to another section. This is just calculating the same thing 17 different ways, and then acting surprised when you get 17 different answers. That is impossible, Glimmerfin sputtered, his gills flapping with indignation. The galaxy's greatest minds have verified the paradox's mathematical integrity for centuries. Yeah, well, sometimes when you're too close to a problem, you can't see the forest for the trees. Jake finished his coffee and headed for the door. Or in this case, you can't see the broken toaster for the quantum mechanics. Broken toaster? Pip chittered frantically. I'll be back tomorrow, Jake called over his shoulder. I want to check something. Jake returned with a laptop that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and good intentions. The scholars watched with growing alarm as he set up what appeared to be the most primitive computational device they had ever seen. What is that archaeological artifact? Zephyr asked, her crystalline form recoiling from the ancient technology. This is my trusty field computer, Jake said, patting the laptop affectionately. She's not much to look at, but she's got it where it counts. Now, can you give me the original Vorthak data? The original data was lost millennia ago, Glimmerfin protested. All we have are the refined interpretations developed by centuries of scholarly analysis. Right, that's the problem. Jake's fingers began dancing across his keyboard with surprising speed. You've been trying to solve the solution instead of the problem. It's like trying to fix a car by studying the repair manual instead of looking under the hood. That analogy makes no sense, Krogmar declared. Exactly my point. Jake's screen filled with numbers and graphs that looked suspiciously simple compared to the holographic complexity floating nearby. See, here's what I think happened. The Vorthaks were trying to solve some kind of practical problem. Maybe engineering, maybe resource management, maybe they were just trying to figure out their taxes. But somewhere along the way, they made an error. The Vorthaks were a highly advanced civilization, Pip protested. They would not make simple errors. Advanced civilizations make the best errors, Jake replied. They're so smart they can screw things up in ways that take centuries to figure out, like this thing here. He pointed to a section of code on his laptop. I bet the original problem was something like calculating optimal resource distribution across multiple star systems. The scholars leaned in despite themselves, drawn by the horrifying possibility that Jake might actually be making sense. But then, Jake continued, somebody made a small mistake. Maybe they used the wrong variable, or maybe they forgot to carry a decimal point. And instead of getting a nice, clean answer, they got this recursive mess that folded back on itself. That is highly speculative, Glimmerfin said, but his gills were fluttering with what might have been nervousness rather than superiority. Is it? Jake's laptop chimed softly. Because I just ran a simulation of what would happen if you corrected for basic computational errors in resource distribution algorithms, and look what you get. He turned the laptop screen toward them. Instead of the mind-bending complexity of the Vorthak Paradox, they saw a simple, elegant solution curve that any first-year student could understand. No, Zephyr whispered, her crystalline structure dimming to almost nothing. That cannot be correct. It's not just correct, Jake said, pulling up another window. It's useful. Look, if you plug in variables for population, resources, and distribution networks, you get a perfect optimization formula for managing supplies across multiple colonies. Krogmar's forearms began to shake. You are suggesting that the greatest mathematical mystery in galactic history is merely a clerical error? Not just any clerical error, Jake said cheerfully. A really persistent one. The kind that gets worse the more smart people try to fix it without understanding what it was supposed to do in the first place. Pip's compound eyes reflected the horror of revelation from 1,000 different angles. But we have built our entire careers on this paradox. We are the foremost experts in Vorthak studies. We have written papers. We have given lectures. We have tenure. Yeah, about that, Jake said, not unkindly. You're experts in studying a mistake. That's like being a professional expert in how to spell cat wrong. The silence that followed was the sound of worldviews crumbling in real time. 3 centuries of academic prestige, countless research grants, and entire university departments were suddenly revealed to be elaborate monuments to a civilization's ancient typo. Furthermore, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis he was causing, once you fix the original error, you can solve dozens of other problems that have been bothering people for years. Colony logistics, trade route optimization, resource allocation, it's all connected. He was right, and they all knew it. The evidence was right there on his primitive laptop screen, clear as day and twice as obvious. The next morning, Jake found the scholars exactly where he had left them, staring at his laptop screen with the intensity of people watching their entire belief system dissolve in real time. So Jake said, settling into a chair with a fresh cup of coffee, ready to hear the complete solution. We are not ready, Glimmerfin said in a voice like a deflating balloon. We may never be ready, but proceed anyway. Jake pulled up his presentation with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted that problems were meant to be solved, not worshipped. Okay, so the Vorthak Paradox isn't actually a paradox. It's a corrupted resource management algorithm that's been getting progressively more tangled for about 4,000 years. How can you possibly know that? Zephyr asked, her crystalline form flickering between despair and desperate hope. Because I've seen this exact same problem before, Jake said. Remember last month when the Institute's power distribution system kept overloading? Same basic issue. You had a feedback loop in the load balancing algorithm that was trying to compensate for a sensor that was reading wrong data. That was completely different, Krogmar protested weakly. Same principle, bigger scale. Jake clicked to his next slide. The Vorthaks were trying to manage resources across multiple star systems, but their sensors were giving them bad data about something, probably shipping delays or population fluctuations. So they built a correction algorithm to compensate. But the correction algorithm was trying to fix data that wasn't actually wrong in the first place, Pip chittered, beginning to understand. Exactly. So it created a feedback loop. The algorithm would make adjustments based on what it thought was wrong data, which would create new problems, which would trigger more adjustments, which would create more problems, and so on. Jake gestured to the holographic paradox. After a few thousand iterations, you get that beautiful, incomprehensible mess. But how do you solve it? Glimmerfin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake grinned and clicked to his final slide. You turn it off and back on again. The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational field. I beg your pardon? Zephyr's voice was crystalline ice. The whole thing is just a runaway process, Jake explained. You clear the corrupted data, reset the algorithm to its original parameters, and restart the system. Like this. He typed a few commands into his laptop. On the holographic display, the Vorthak Paradox began to shimmer and change. The impossible equations started to simplify, the recursive loops began to unwind, and the mathematical impossibility began to transform into something that looked suspiciously like a perfectly ordinary resource management system. Within minutes, the greatest unsolved mystery in galactic history had become a reasonably sophisticated but entirely comprehensible logistics program. "No," Krogmar whispered. "This cannot be happening." "Oh, but it gets better," Jake said, clearly enjoying himself. "Now that we've got the algorithm working properly, we can use it to solve all sorts of problems. Colony supply chains, interstellar trade routes, even academic resource allocation." He pulled up a new window. "For instance, I ran the numbers on the Galactic Institute's research budget, and according to the Vorthak algorithm, you've been spending about 400% more than necessary on theoretical mathematics and about 90% less than optimal on practical applications." "That is impossible," Glimmerfin sputtered. "Our budget allocation is the result of careful scholarly consideration." "Your budget allocation is the result of 3 centuries of people making the same mistake over and over again," Jake corrected. "Just like the paradox." The weight of revelation settled over the scholars like a blanket made of crushed dreams and shattered egos. They had dedicated their lives to solving the unsolvable, only to discover that the unsolvable had been solved by turning it off and on again. "So what do we do now?" Pip asked in a voice smaller than his usual chittering anxiety. Jake shrugged. "Now you get back to work. But this time, maybe try solving problems that actually need solving." 3 months later, the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences looked remarkably different. The towering spires of crystalline mathematics had been replaced by practical workshop spaces. The holographic equations drifting through the air had been replaced by actual working prototypes. And at the center of it all, wearing coveralls that had been upgraded from post-apocalyptic to merely well-worn, sat Jake Murphy, theoretical maintenance specialist. "Okay, people," Jake called to his team. "What have we got today?" Professor Glimmerfin, whose gills had learned to flutter with enthusiasm rather than pomposity, consulted his tablet. "The Andorian Trade Federation is still having problems with their shipping optimization. The Crystalline Collective needs help with their manufacturing efficiency protocols. And the Warrior Academy of Mars wants us to review their tactical logistics systems." "Right," Jake said, rolling up his sleeves. "Zephyr, you're on the Andorian problem. Remember, if it looks too complicated, it probably means someone made an error somewhere. Krogmar, take the tactical logistics. I know you've been dying to apply military precision to supply chain management." The former scholars, now proudly bearing the title of applied problem-solving specialists, that scattered to their workstations with the enthusiasm of people who had rediscovered the joy of actually accomplishing things. "What about the Crystalline Collective?" Pip asked, his anxiety having transformed into the productive nervousness of someone with interesting work to do. "That's all yours," Jake said. "Manufacturing efficiency is right up your alley. Just remember the first rule of applied problem solving. When something seems impossible, check if someone forgot to plug it in," Pip recited dutifully. "And the second rule? If it's still impossible after checking the power supply, someone probably made a typo in the code. And the third rule? If it's still impossible after fixing the typos, you're probably asking the wrong question." Jake nodded approvingly. It had taken months to retrain minds that had been conditioned to embrace failure as a virtue, but the results spoke for themselves. In the past 3 months, the Institute had solved more practical problems than it had in the previous 3 centuries. "Oh, and Professor," Jake called to Glimmerfin. "How's that paper coming along?" Glimmerfin's gills fluttered with what could only be described as pride. "The Journal of Applied Galactic Problem Solving has accepted our submission. From Paradox to Practicality, a case study in correcting centuries of accumulated error, should be published next month." "Excellent. And the speaking engagement?" "The Galactic Conference on Practical Applications of Theoretical Knowledge has invited us to present the keynote address." Glimmerfin paused, his fishy features managing to convey something approaching humility. "They want to know how we revolutionize the field of academic problem-solving." Jake chuckled. "Just remember to mention that the revolution consisted of asking what the problem was actually supposed to solve." As the day progressed, Jake found himself handling a steady stream of previously impossible problems. The quantum mechanics lab's particle accelerator that kept producing unstable results. Someone had been calibrating it with the wrong universal constants. The xenobiology department's mysterious organism that defied classification. It was actually 3 different organisms that had been accidentally mixed together in the same sample. The theoretical physics department's unified field theory that predicted the universe should have collapsed years ago. They had been using an equation that was missing a negative sign. By the end of the day, Jake had solved 17 impossible problems, optimized 3 galactic trade routes, and discovered that the Institute's central computer had been calculating lunch orders using the same corrupted algorithm that had created the Vorthak Paradox in the first place. "You know," Zephyr said as they gathered around the coffee machine for their daily debrief, "I have been thinking about something." "What's that?" Jake asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee that still tasted like coffee instead of pretentious disappointment. "For centuries, we believed that the highest form of intelligence was the ability to contemplate the incomprehensible. But perhaps true intelligence is the ability to make the incomprehensible comprehensible." Or Krogmar added, "the ability to recognize when something is incomprehensible because someone made a stupid mistake." Or Pip chittered thoughtfully, "the wisdom to ask stupid questions until you get smart answers." Jake raised his coffee cup in a toast. To asking stupid questions, fixing stupid mistakes, and remembering that most impossible problems are just possible problems that nobody's bothered to solve yet. They drank to that, 4 beings from 4 different worlds united by the revolutionary concept that problems existed to be solved, not worshipped. Outside the Institute's windows, the galaxy continued to spin on its axis, blissfully unaware that some of its greatest mysteries were probably just very old typos waiting for someone to check the original documentation. And in a workshop on the 3rd floor, a maintenance technician from a little blue planet continued to prove that sometimes the most sophisticated problems require the most unsophisticated solutions. After all, the universe runs on the same basic principles as a coffee machine. If it's not working, check the power supply, clean the filters, and if all else fails, turn it off and back on again. The only difference is the scale of the problems and the size of the coffee cups required to fuel their solutions.